This episode of This Agile Life has been brought to you by BrilliantAgile.com, providing Agile and Scrum training, consultancy, and personnel.
BrilliantAgile.com. Done right, it's brilliant.
Released on Sunday, August 21st, 2016.
This Agile Life, episode 117.
Rubber Duck Effect.
This episode of This Agile Life is brought to you by Agile Dev East, the premier industry conference for Agile development professionals. To find out more, go to adceast.techwell.com.
The software industry transforms more and more every day. Agile methods are quickly replacing traditional ones. The question is, are you agile enough? This podcast is devoted to agile and lean software development. Time to welcome your agile coaches on This Agile Life.
Hello, everyone. I'm the host of This Agile Life, John Sextro.
And I'm Lee McCauley.
And I'm Craig Buchek.
Welcome to This Agile Life. We're going to be talking this episode about Scrum versus Kanban. Anthony Bruno, in our This Agile Life Slack channel, he put this topic out there from his suggestion that we're talking about this tonight. So he's working with he's worked on teams and with companies before where they're doing Scrum and they're interested in transitioning to something a little bit more Kanban-like. So probably we should start a little bit by talking about maybe what the differences are, I guess. Starting with Kanban, I think it's a lean approach based on the Toyota lean manufacturing methods that's been transported over to software development. And there aren't any ceremonies specifically called for within Kanban. The main features of Kanban are tracking work on a Kanban board and using work in process, work in progress limits on those columns. Guys, anything else that that uniquely identifies Kanban?
I don't think so. I've always wondered whether people are including continuous flow with Kanban.
And continuous flow is the work continuously flowing through the board. You're not working over any sort of a specified like sprint or iteration. Work continually flows into the system in an organized fashion through the system and then out the system into production.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Kanban really calls for that, but I've seen a lot of teams that say they're using Kanban also happen to be doing continuous flow. So I wonder if those are kind of getting stuck together.
I think Kanban implies a continuous flow. I mean, it's used for manufacturing like an assembly line. You can think of things flowing through your assembly line. And one thing you didn't mention, I don't think, is what does Kanban mean? Literally, it's billboard or signboard in Japanese. So, the Kanban board is literally a big part of what Kanban means.
I think along with Kanban, there's continuous improvement as well, a focus on quality, and certainly, and oftentimes there's a session called Kaizen that they do as part of Kanban, which is like a retrospective, but slightly different. So then Scrum, I think people are most familiar with what Scrum is. Of course, we have the cadence of the sprints or the iterations, depending on what you call them. 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, hopefully not a whole lot longer than that in those sprints and iterations. And then there are the cadence meetings that are sprint planning, retrospective, daily stand-ups, backlog grooming. What other things, guys? Anything else I missed?
Pulling work from left to right. Well, starting from the right, pulling it from the right instead of pushing it into the queue of work to be done. You pull the thing that's closest to being done.
So I think that's a good description of what we mean when we're saying Scrum and Kanban. And now to, I guess, Anthony's question, which really is, how do you go about as an organization that is comfortable with executing, developing using a Scrum methodology? how do you evolve, transition to using Kanban or maybe a combination of Scrum and Kanban. And I'll kind of get the ball rolling here and say that I think the first step, if I was doing this, the first thing that I would try to get towards is to reduce the sprint cycles, the sprint demarcation of beginning of a sprint and end of a sprint, and move more towards that continuous flow where you're constantly grooming the backlog, you're constantly making work ready to be done, and then allowing that work to come in rather than take time. I think that to me is the biggest efficiency that I think you can gain by going from Scrum to Kanban. And so I would try and tackle that first. Guys, what do you think about tackling cutting out the sprint planning meetings and moving towards continuous flow as a first step?
Yeah, continuous planning, actually. So you probably want to groom a couple cards every day, depending on how many you have flow through, instead of, stacking them all up and grooming them on a Monday or Friday or whatever you do.
Yeah, I think that we're doing Kanban right now, although I'm not sure we officially called it that, but we're using the Kanban board and we're doing continuous flow. The interesting part as far as the planning goes is we do an as-needed planning. We do have a set time every week where we can use that for planning, and that's primarily so that our business experts have a way to block off their time. But we can kind of, the other thing that we're kind of doing differently here, I think it's differently, is our business people and our product owner really only talk about the feature levels, and then the developers get together and break those down. And so the PO, the product owner, still has the sole right to decide what the priority is on features, but within that feature, the developers get to decide how the stories break down and what the order is within that within the boundaries of that feature.
So with respect to the planning, I've seen some teams that had a low water mark of stories in ready, and if you get below that low water mark, you plan out some stories or groom the backlog and pull them into ready.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're doing. Is we've got we kind of keep our eye out as long as we know we've got about 2 weeks worth of work that we think it's going to take us about 2 weeks. Then we're not worried about calling a meeting to groom new stuff. But as soon as we get below about 2 weeks worth of work, which for us is about 12 stories right now, then that's when we start having meetings and figuring out what we're going to keep working on.
So Lee, you said 12 stories. You didn't say 40 points.
No.
Have you stopped estimating story points?
Yes.
So
every story is because the tool we're using has to actually have a point on it, a point value. Every story is a point.
So that seems typical, actually, for once you get to the continuous flow. The points really, I'm not sure the points ever mattered, but they matter even less.
Yeah.
And especially since you don't have to figure out how many, points you can fit into an iteration because you don't have an iteration anymore. The points don't seem as useful. And if you need to know how long something's going to take, you usually look at the word's escaping me.
Cycle time?
Cycle time. Yeah, the cycle time.
Yeah, we're actually using the Monte Carlo method of predicting. So we're not telling the users or our product owners or the business people when we're going to get something done. We give them a forecast. We have a 80% likelihood that on the stated release date that the stories we currently have for that release will get completed. So yeah, there's a 20% chance we're lying to them, but it's more like a forecast of weather, and that seems to be working really well.
That's that could be very helpful to Anthony in his situation, because I would imagine if his management is questioning whether or not Kanban can work, one of the things that they might have trepidation about as they approach it is, well, how will I know how much work the team can do, since we're not committing to a certain amount of stories or a certain amount of story points for a sprint? And so looking into Monte Carlo simulations may be helpful. And Lee, I'm somewhat familiar with Monte Carlo simulations, but can you give us a little bit more detail about what's behind a Monte Carlo simulation?
Yeah. So without going too deep into the math, because I wouldn't be able to do it justice, you basically have most of the time there's a spreadsheet that'll do this, but you plot it against hopefully real values. So it's usually we have like a sliding window over the last 6 weeks. So over the last 6 weeks, how many stories did we get done in each week? What was our low and our high value for the lowest week and our best week, and we keep all of those. Even if we never make an excuse. Oh, well, that week we had a couple of people out, and no, it's none of that. You just take the real numbers, and for the last 6 weeks, this is what we got done, and it basically randomly creates a simulation of, well, given the number of stories you have left, how many of those simulations ended up with you actually completing them on time. So that's basically it, and that becomes the percentage. In general, we have about 1,000 different. Anything less than about 1,000 iterations of that, 1,000 different cases, doesn't really get us down to the accuracy that we want. So,
are you saying you have to have real data on 1,000 stories before?
No. What I'm saying is it generates 1,000 different simulated occurrences. So it basically simulates until whatever day that you say you need to have stuff done, and how many stories you need to have by that day, and it simulates what the likelihood is based on the past data that you actually get it done on that day. And that's what that forecast then becomes is, well, 83% of the time in our 1,000 simulations, you got it. The team got it done in that time, and 17% they didn't.
That's interesting. In the way that it runs runs some random tests with your model. That's the way that 538 does their election forecasting too. And they also do baseball forecasting too, I think.
So, Craig, you want to talk a little bit about another topic here, maybe Kanban boards and how to transition towards that? So,
originally, when Kanban was introduced to me, everyone was doing a physical board, and you had stories on physical cards. Maybe a note card, maybe a printout of a story from a story system. And it's on a physical board, and you'd move it if you finished something in development, you'd move it to the testing column. And when you finished the testing, you'd move it to the verification step or whatever you had there. And so that was kind of nice. We had one team where we would put our pictures on the stories, and you could just look at the board in a glance and tell what's going on. In some ways, that is, I guess that's an information radiator is one of the Agile terms I've seen. So anyone can look at that at a glance and have the information that they're looking for. In some ways, that makes your stand-up meeting, which usually a Kanban team will still do, and you can talk to the board. You'll usually look at the board starting from the right and talk about any challenges that you have in any cards. So instead of going around and having each individual talk, you can talk about each card on the board.
Yeah, that's a good distinction there, because typical Scrum would say that the way you execute a stand-up is that you go around to each individual, and each individual says, what I accomplished yesterday, what I plan to accomplish today, and if there's anything blocking me from making that planned accomplishment for the day. So in Kanban, as Craig was saying, there's another way you can do it where you talk to the board and you address what's going on with each card regardless of who did the work. And usually it's the people that did the work that discuss it, but they don't go through those necessarily 3 categories of information. Another thing that I notice with Kanban, or that I think is a distinction between Kanban and Scrum, is that often, I think almost without exception, in a true Kanban system, you will specify work in progress limits on your work columns. And that's not something that you typically see in a Scrum configuration, right, guys?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. At least Scrum doesn't talk about WIP limits as far as I know.
So that's a key distinction, and I think that that's a benefit to your group because it prevents what I've seen in the past where work tends to accumulate in columns and stay there for an extended period of time, and you have this this thing that tends to happen, and I always called it the tree that would fall over. These columns would get real long, and then that tree would fall over, and it falls over into somebody else's house, someone else's column, and basically destroys their world because now they've got all of this work that suddenly got dumped into their lap.
Yeah, a good example of that is right now we've got our ready for QA column just got over the last couple of days overloaded. The WIP limit is supposed to be like 4 or 5 on that column, and I think they hit 9. And so the dev team then says, "Oh well, I guess we're pulling from that column," and they start. And not to say that they're going to be QAing their own stuff, because sometimes that can be a conflict of interest. But we're writing additional automated tests that otherwise the QA would end up writing. I won't go into why we're not writing more of those at the beginning. It has to do with data access, but that's kind of what we mean by that is people start pulling from other columns that they wouldn't normally look at when the WIP limit goes too high.
I think, and maybe follow up here, Lee, with you on this point, since you're mentioning people working on different columns. One thing that I noticed, and difference-wise between teams that are doing something more Kanban centric as opposed to Scrum centric, is that the teams that do Scrum, in a lot of cases, really do have people specified to work on only certain columns. You might have BAs that are working on columns further to the left that are things that are along the lines of adding business notes, adding in there the gherkin syntax for given, when, thens with things, and then you've got devs working on the middle set of columns doing development, testing, dev testing, code review sort of stuff, and then in the right columns you often have quality assurance engineers doing activity. Again, that's in the Scrum world. So you were talking about people working in columns that they don't normally work in, and I think that's more typical of the Kanban approach, where in the lean manufacturing world you kind of go where you are needed most that day in the manufacturing, right? If they need people to quality check windshields rather than produce new windshields, well, you go and do that. How do you see that playing out in practice on your particular team, Lee?
So I think in this particular team right now, it works really well because it's definitely something that developers can help with without giving our business people a fright that the same people that are writing the code are also the ones approving the code or approving that the business feature has been completed. There's still trust issues, right, that sometimes you have to get over. So I think in this case, it's going to work really well, and it has been working the last couple of days. But I'm not sure that it always has the same outcome. I would be curious to see what other people have had.
Craig, what do you think about that?
I find that teams doing Kanban tend to be a little more advanced than teams doing Scrum. And what I mean by that is they've kind of, abandoned points, estimations. Their stories are usually a little broken down a little more. So they're further along in their Agile journey, I'll say. So that has the advantage that you tend to have by that point, people are more T-shaped. So T-shaped means that they have both breadth and depth of skills and experience. So at that point, usually, your developers have had enough experience working with QA people that they can do QA in a pinch. And you set up rules so you don't QA your own stuff. Obviously, that doesn't work very well usually. So what ends up happening is, I guess like Lee said, you kind of go where the work is needed. One of the things with Kanban is you work the rightmost card that you're able to work. And I've seen it where teams where some of the developers were able to do QA and some weren't, depending on their experience and skills. So the developers that finish a card and are able to do some QA, if there's a QA card to the right of anything else they can work on, they'll work on that. And the people that aren't comfortable with working with QA, they'll pick up another development card if they can't work that rightmost card.
And what about the opposite, or maybe the inverse of that, where maybe development could use some help today, and pulling in a business analyst or a quality engineer to help work stories in development? Do you see that happening?
Once in a while, depends on those people's skills, but I love pairing with non-developers. Pairing with a QA person, maybe on writing some test first tests, some acceptance criteria. It usually ends up with better than I would have written by myself, and they usually end up with the same sort of feeling. There's always the rubber duck effect. Even if you're pairing with someone that doesn't know code, you can bounce ideas off of them, and sometimes just asking the question, you'll have some insight just by asking the question.
So the rubber duck effect is bouncing questions off of people?
That seems to be
I've never
how
heard
it works
that.
for me.
Lee, is that what it is?
Yeah, so the rubber duck thing is we actually had this in one of our teams where I brought in a big rubber ducky, and anybody that for whatever reason didn't have a pair on a given day, they got the rubber duck next to them. So what that is when you're explaining something to somebody, right? So you've got some problem and you go seek somebody out. I gotta help me with this problem, and you explain the problem. And as you're explaining the problem, the solution to the problem comes to you because you're being forced to think about the problem in a different way because you're having to explain it to somebody. And that just breaks you out of the rut you were in, and you get the solution. And they didn't have to say a word. They just had to sit there, and they were as good as a rubber duck.
I need to buy a bunch of rubber ducks, sounds like. It's a great idea. The rubber duck effect, I love it. Well, in the game Get Kanban, which I think both of you guys have played, and for any of our listeners who haven't played it or don't know of the Get Kanban game, you should go check that out because it's fun, and it's something that I would recommend to Anthony for him to check out and possibly bring that in and do that as an exercise with his team. There's the concept of the different colored dice for the people that do the different roles on the team, and And there's certainly an aspect to that game, I'm not giving anything away here, where you'll use people outside of their roles at a discounted rate, of course, working in another column that they're not used to working in. But that swarming effect to make sure that you're managing your WIP limits is very important, I think, to the concept of Kanban.
So why is that important to keep your WIP limits, though? Besides, I think you talked about sort of being overloaded in one column, but what the other thing that it does is it makes sure that it reduces waste is the term that they like to use actually in Kanban. And waste is the potential that if you run out of money today, you've got all these cards that were in progress, all these stories that were in progress, and never made it to production. The idea is to get everything to production as quickly as you possibly can. So if your project gets canceled, you've got as much of that in production as possible.
So let me also talk, since we're talking about this particular WIP limit thing, I have to say that in an ideal world, you don't need WIP limits. The ideal world is where everybody can work in any of the columns, and you're always pulling from the right, and or starting from the right, pulling stuff in, and that includes every column on the board. So then if you're doing that and you're not breaking that rule, you never will go above your WIP limit, ever. There's no purpose for it.
You might run into it if you have a situation where you're the one that completed the work in column A, it moves to column B, and there's a rule that you can't, check your own work. So you can run into that situation in that case.
Sure, but only if you're the only one working for several days.
So I found a team that had a good solution to that, and that was every time you finish a card, one of you switches off. And another person switches on to that card, actually. So you finish the card, let's say in development, and you're like, hey, guys, pair switch time. I need someone to come on to this card and code review it with me. So one person stays on the card, another person comes on and does code review, and then I guess that person switches off and another person comes on to do QA work.
So that works really well unless you're actually completing multiple stories every day. And when I say multiple, I mean like today, for example, in my team, we probably had 6 or 7 finished items that hit within about 2 hours of each other.
Yeah, you probably want to just do a sort of a timed pair switching probably every couple hours at that point.
Exactly. So that's my only problem with that particular methodology is that you end up with, we're switching again? Oh my gosh, I was just in the middle of something else. And anyway.
It's a good point that you make, Lee, because that's true. If you really are working in a swarm approach where you always pull from the right, you never work a column, you never work something out of order, you don't necessarily need the WIP limits. They become sort of artificial. And on a lot of teams that I've been a part of over a period of time, we always would start with the WIP limits. And we'd do some calculation to say, well, how many cards would it be likely that we could have in development at any time, and making sure that there's headroom there. And then over time, we talk about, do we really need these WIP limits anymore? And everybody's like, no, probably not. I'll just leave them up there so we don't have to reorganize the board or whatever it is that we're doing. Right. So it's something that you improve. Hopefully, you improve towards. But that brings up another thing that I wanted to mention, which is the reason for the board is a couple of things. One, it's to visualize the workflow. So by having that board, everyone can visualize how the work is done on the team. And the second thing is that it makes the workflow and the WIP policies explicit. so it's not left to anyone to guess at, right? You have the whip right there on the column, and then the third thing is that it just makes it really easy for people to self-service information about what the team is doing. Anybody can walk in and see the board. If it's a physical board or if it's an electronic board, that's even easier for people to see, is to view your electronic board. But those are some real big advantages to using a Kanban board, not just specific to the Kanban process.
You talked about virtual Kanban boards, and we hadn't really gotten there. I don't know what to suggest as far as physical versus virtual Kanban boards. I guess if you're a distributed team, you're definitely going to have the virtual board. I found them to work pretty much equivalently. I don't have a preference one way or the other, actually. Although I do like that things that can integrate with GitHub. So you can actually do a commit, and you can put your story number, and it can actually track where things are in the process. I do like that. I've seen a plugin, I believe it was for Jira, where you could use Jira, but you could print out a card for each story, and it would put a QR code, and you could just take a picture of the board, and it would update your Jira board automatically from the physical board.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. This AgileLife.com.
Before we go on, let me tell you about our sponsor. Agile Dev East is the premier industry event covering the latest techniques and topics in the Agile universe. Learn both foundational knowledge and new methodologies to develop skills, supercharge knowledge, and re-energize your career growth. This year's event will take place November 13th through the 18th in Orlando, Florida. As an added bonus, the event is co-located with Better Software and DevOps East conferences. Your one registration automatically gives you access to all three programs. This means you can choose from over 100 learning and networking opportunities to build a customized week of learning that fits you and your organization's specific needs. Explore the program at adceast.techwell.com. Also, don't miss the Agile Leadership Summit at the end of the conference. The summit is a full day of in-depth discussion about increasing leadership mastery, with the opportunity to learn new ways to challenge your personal leadership growth and to lead in your organizational challenges. This Agile Life listeners receive an exclusive discount of up to $600 off with code AgileLife when they register by the September 16th super early bird deadline at adceast.techwell.com.
This AgileLife.com.
Well, I guess one thing that we haven't addressed is the use of the ceremonies, the Scrum ceremonies. People have come to rely on the Scrum ceremonies in their Scrum process, and we've talked a little bit about the continuous planning, so removing of the sprint planning. But what do you think about the other ceremonies, such as the daily stand-up, the retrospective, the demo? Would you stop those as you transition to Kanban, or keep them?
This becomes a question of for each team, right? Are they providing value? So a ceremony is only as good as what you're getting out of it. At the point where, to some degree, a lot of those ceremonies, and Scrum, I don't think would deny this, a lot of those ceremonies are training wheels for groups to get into an agile sort of a mindset and to get their feet wet. But then they have to also keep in mind that they may grow beyond them at some point. Many of them they won't. The stand-ups, the retros. I mean, there are lots of those things that people will just keep because they're useful. But they should be keeping them because they're useful, not because there's some ritual.
What about the demo? I hear a lot of teams complaining about taking the time each week or every couple of weeks, or however frequently you're doing it, to prepare for and then execute a demo. Craig,
heaven forbid we actually get information from our actual users. If you're not on a team that's delivering constantly and actually getting your customers to use the code immediately, then why wouldn't you?
I don't know. I agree with you, Lee. Craig, what do you think?
Demos usually happen too infrequently. I think in most teams I've seen, I would kind of want to keep that ceremony of having a rhythm of demos on some sort of timeline. Weekly, every other week, daily. I don't know about that, but somehow getting the new work out in front of some users and getting feedback is the important part. I guess you don't necessarily need to have a demo as long as you've got some way to get that feedback from the users. But if you don't have a good way to do that, a ceremony is probably your best bet still.
I think what I've seen happen with companies or with groups that don't demo enough or where people complain about demos is in those organizations where there's some requirement to put together a series of PowerPoint slides and the fear of something not working during a demo or something not being as polished as maybe one would like it to be when you're going to be standing there in front of others and showing off work. But it is really important to show your progress. If you could do something where you're demoing frequently by pushing code into some sort of a pre-production environment and then having people put eyes on it daily or hourly, you could maybe cut out the ceremony. But until you crack that nut, I think you need to keep doing the demos but lean them out, right? Get rid of the PowerPoint presentation that the managers are saying that you need and focus on just showing the working software.
People do PowerPoints for demos? Oh my God.
You have no idea.
Sounds horrible.
Indeed.
Go ahead.
I actually worked with a team where all of the stuff that we were doing was middleware. It was a systems integration. And so there was nothing that we could really show to anybody. So it had to be, we demoed basically by PowerPoint. We completed this part of the systems integration, and it was quite interesting. But it
couldn't you show the two systems after they've been integrated?
Not easily. It was a lot of behind the scenes sort of back end sort of integration.
Huh, that's weird because my current project is a lot of integrating various pieces, but we basically show the whole. I mean, we're doing that to create some sort of whole user experience.
Without going into a lot of the details, there was one company had purchased the other company and we're integrating some ordering systems.
Okay.
And we didn't necessarily have access to the other company's ordering system, but we knew we were getting this thing like this, and it had to pipe through our system like this, and then end up over there.
So you probably didn't have any real tests either. I guess you had like unit tests, but no integration test because you have no access to the other system you're integrating with.
Right. So we created kind of a front door of tests using something called it's a wiki-based testing framework. Fitness. That's it. That was what we did. So that was our front door since we didn't have the real system.
Yeah, it's hard to do Agile when you're limited in a way that just completely slams the door in your face.
We were still able to do Agile. It just made demos a little bit prickly. We had to figure some things out for how to show what we were accomplishing. But we did it.
So other Scrum ceremonies, retrospectives. So in Scrum, your retrospectives fall on sprint boundaries. So I like to do retrospectives still at a cadence, every other week, maybe every week. So that's pretty similar to what a Scrum sprint would be. So I don't change that too drastically. What else is there? Stand up. Did we talk about stand up? I wouldn't really change stand up except to, like we said earlier, focus on the cards on the board instead of going through each person.
There's also an additional way that you can do that, which is focus on a column at a time and say, hey, in this column, are there any blockers? And then people speak up. I think the interesting part of that is to get to the point where you're talking to cards or you're talking to columns. You also have to trust your people that they're actually doing the best they can, right? They're doing everything they can as fast as they can. And you don't need them to justify their existence every day at a stand-up.
I finished card number 12 and I started card number 14. Yeah, I could have looked at the board and told that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yesterday I worked on number 15. Today I'm going to continue on number 15. No blockers.
Tomorrow I'll still be working on 15.
Gee,
I'll be
you guys have
stuck on
heard
it for
this.
a week. It's the stand-up that devolves into a status meeting.
Yeah. So I think maybe we've covered a lot of the high points. Why don't we each take a moment here and if we have any things to say as kind of our final note on advice to our specific listener, Anthony Bruno, and his company that are working on their evolution of Agile, we can provide him with some final bits of parting wisdom. Craig, you look like you're ready at the bit to.
I've got two short topics I want to talk about. One is the argument, which I've never had a team that completely agreed on the answer to this. Can cards move backwards in Kanban? In some ways, I think about the analogy, if a car gets to the end of the assembly line and you find out that it's got a bad wheel, do you stop the entire line and bring some wheels to that car, or you just take that car back to the wheel portion of the line and put some replacement wheels on? I don't know. I guess it depends on the situation. I've heard teams that are people that say you definitely if there's a problem that a card got moved forward and it wasn't ready, there was a problem, then you sort of stop the assembly line and everyone stops and fixes it. But I don't think you need to stop everybody in most situations.
Yeah, I think the dirty secret to that question, well, first of all, the answer is, can you move a card backwards? No. Okay? No.
I disagree.
But hold on a second. But the dirty secret is, of course, we can do whatever the hell we want to do. But your going in assumption should be no. You can't move anything back. Because you can't get that car back onto the assembly line. There's no.
Maybe we don't know how assembly lines work.
You don't know how assembly lines work. I know how assembly lines work. You can't get a car back on the assembly line. Can you lift a car? I mean, it's not the same thing, right? So the short answer is no.
I can drive it.
Sure. The short answer is no. Nothing can ever go back until it needs to, and then you do it. But in a lot of cases, what I will say is, no, let's not move it back. Let's write another story that's going to put the wheels on the car, and we'll set that car aside, and then we'll write up what work needs to be done and do it separately, but right away.
We had a team that put a lemon on the card. It was a physical Kanban board, and we had a picture of a lemon, and that car was a lemon, and we had to fix it we basically had to do some development work when it was in the QA column. That's what the lemon meant.
So you could make lemonade.
No, I don't think so. I think it was just the lemon. It was the lemon law, not the lemonade law.
I see. What else did you want to talk about, Craig?
The other thing I want to talk about was swim lanes, which is so Kanban.
It is the Olympics right now. We have to talk about swim lanes.
That's true, and I'm not talking about green water in the pool this time, so that's good. So Kanban boards are all about the columns. You've got a ready column on the left, and then a working, and then reviewing, and then QAing, and then deploying, and then production. Usually something like that. So a swim lane is a row across the board, and it's usually used for priority stories. So you have like this top lane for things that need to be done quicker. And so you sort of have this 2-tiered priority system of, we work the rightmost column, but we work the top swim lane first. And if the top swim lane gets more priority than the rightmost column, that depends on what your team has chosen. But swim lanes can sometimes be useful. I've also seen where each feature had a swim lane. So you basically have sort of a mini Kanban board for each feature, or feature set or epic. And so, the authentication stories might have their own swim lane, and then the UI stories might have their own swim lane.
All right. Lee, did you have any final topics or final thoughts?
Well, I think the original question was, how do you go from being a Scrum team to being a Kanban team, right?
Yes.
So I think to try to get back to that original question, I think the trick is making sure that you can do something like continuous flow, because you're probably using a Kanban board, even if you're doing Scrum. And you may not know it, but you may be using what's called Scrumban. And in my picks, I'll have a link to a description of that. But you may already be using some of the Kanban techniques, even though you're doing a Scrum. You're having some of the Scrum ceremonies. So it may be just as simple as picking out the thing that you think is going to be best for your team, like continuous flow or no estimations or something like that, and just trying to take that next step towards where you want to go and forget about what the label is.
I think that's excellent advice. I will add a little bit to it. My advice is to listen to what Lee and Craig said. And then if people are uncomfortable with Kanban, if your management is uncomfortable with Kanban, maybe have a retrospective with them about that, where you can openly sit down and talk about what are the concerns. I would also encourage you to try to play the game, get Kanban with them. It might help really convey to them the ideas and principles behind Kanban and give them a real sense for what's different and what's the same. I think they will actually have fun playing it. It is a fun activity to do, but you also learn a lot about the approach. And you will learn a lot about something else that we didn't talk about tonight, which is the cumulative flow diagram. And that might be something that the management is interested in seeing regularly as a sort of a metric or a guide as to how the team's doing. So those are my final 2 bits of advice. Have a retrospective on the topic and play the game Get Kanban. And all the money you spend on the game Get Kanban should be sent to me since I recommended it.
This week's hottest picks.
Lee, you're up first with your picks this episode.
Great. Okay, so I had 2 picks. I mentioned the Scrumban, and there's a pretty decent description of it at the link by a guy's name. There's no way I'm going to be able to pronounce this, but the title of it is Scrumban, Being Differently Agile, by Arunkumar Thangaraj.
You got it. You nailed it. I think so.
I think you did.
So go check that out if you're curious. My other pick is something that we've been using on my current team, and I've gotten a lot of good use out of it. And probably anybody that's doing Angular already knows about this stuff. But like many things with technology, I always seem to be behind the curve. So just in case there are other people as behind the curve as I am, go check out Protractor, which is an end-to-end testing system with Selenium as the back end to do testing, functional testing in Angular.
I've been told that it works. We were discussing it the other day, and we're not using Angular, and someone said Protractor will work with non-Angular JavaScript apps.
It will.
Man, I've been using Protractor since grade school. You are behind, Lee. Now, Lee, are you going to start selling a personalized line of Lee McCauley rubber duckies?
I'm not sure exactly what that would look like. That's a darn good idea, though.
I get half of that money, too. All right, my pick tonight, Craig's been waiting for this one. My pick tonight is something called Camel, Camel, Camel. And it's probably not at all what you're thinking it is unless you've used it or seen it before. It's a price tracker for Amazon. And I've used it quite frequently. There's a couple of things that I kind of buy often. I won't go into the details, but excuse me. So I put those things in there. You can put in the link to whatever the item is in that you're interested in watching. If maybe you want to buy a new monitor, so you figure out the monitor that you want to buy. You put it into Camel, 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 and it watches the price. You tell it sort of a range of prices that you're interested in watching it at, when you might want to buy it. And then Camel watches that. Camel, Camel, Camel watches that for you and sends you email notifications when it falls into the range you're looking for.
Does it do that thing where it predicts if it's going to be going up or down in the future?
It has past data on the prices. So I'm not sure if it predicts for you, but it will show you what the historic prices are.
I've seen airfare where there's things that will tell you if it's expected to go up or down, which is kind of interesting.
No, I haven't seen that actually, so that would be interesting. You'll have to point me at that sometime. All right, Craig, what are your picks for this episode?
My first is Get Out the Vote. And I'm going to link to just the Wikipedia page on Get Out the Vote. I'm not going to suggest a particular organization to go work with. But the idea of Get Out the Vote is that you basically canvass. You go to a neighborhood. Someone has basically done some legwork for you to figure out who doesn't vote all the time, but might be likely to vote your way. And it's usually a neighborhood that's more likely to vote your way. So you go knock on the door. You've got the list of addresses of voters that fit those categories. You go knock on the door. You ask a question to basically feel out whether they're going to vote your way or the other way. And if they're going to vote the other way, you basically move on. And if they're going to vote your way, you encourage them to go vote with whatever that might take, offering them a ride, telling them the importance of the issues, whatever. So I'm actually considering this election to go to a different state, where a swing state, where I might have some bigger impact than my own state. And the cool thing about Get Out the Vote is it's a good way to magnify your vote legally. One of the few ways to, especially cheaply, magnify your vote.
But you only have a 2-seater vehicle. I mean, you can only take one other person then to the polling place. But you can do it really fast.
There are organizations that also will help with those kinds of things.
I see.
Usually the organization you're working with has a plan for that as well. The other, my next pick is something I heard on a podcast, and it was the idea of a service culture. We've talked about servant leadership. This is sort of taking that to the masses, to everyone in your organization, and having a service mindset. And I thought that was a good idea. I don't have any links. The couple links I found were kind of marketing type things. So I just encourage people to go look into the idea of a service culture. And my final pick is something even weirder. My third pick is having crazy ideas that will never work. So last week I had a crazy idea on how to solve homelessness. So I was going to have some lunch, and there was a mattress store next door to where we were eating. And I was like, all those mattresses go unused at night, and we have homeless people that don't have mattresses to sleep on at night. Why don't we get those two sides together, and we could solve homelessness? And I'm like, I know that's a crazy idea, but just having that idea was kind of a creative act, and sharing that idea is kind of a crazy act in itself as well. And then I had another crazy, I had like 3 or 4 Monday night. But my crazy idea Monday night was starting a company that will do every project in duplicate. so that we can solve the problem of not having studies on, well, what happens if you vary this or you vary that? So you'd be doing the same project twice and varying one variable at a time. So we could do studies on those things. And you're like, well, that's stupid. Who would pay twice as much? I don't know, but maybe someone would.
The government.
But yeah, that was someone said that they might.
Those are two excellently crazy ideas. I love them. Well, good picks, Craig. All right, guys, that's all we have for this episode of This Agile Life. Be sure to check out the website at thisagilelife.com for more details on these topics tonight. You can find the links to our picks and some of the links to the other things that we discussed in the show. Thanks for listening and keep living this Agile life.
This Agile Life is brought to you by a community of Agile developers and coaches aspiring to spread the word about this groundbreaking approach to software development. Join us at thisagilelife.com/community.